When it comes to faith, people are often filled with questions. Who is God? Did Jesus really come down to earth? Is the Bible true? What does it mean to be a Christian? What if we told you that there are two questions that are the most important questions you can ask when it comes to your spiritual life? During this 2-week series, we'll unpack these questions and all that they can mean for your life.
Well, welcome to Meck's online campus, and welcome to the start of the NFL season. Every year, football fans enter a new season with a set of questions, and this year is no different. Here's what we're carrying into this year's start. I was doing some research on the NFL Network and ESPN and other things, and here seem to be the top questions that are being asked as we start off the season. First, can Aaron Rodgers actually rebound back for the Jets? The Jets put all their eggs in Rodgers' basket in hopes that the 4-time MVP can come back from a less than stellar season that he had in Green Bay and lead them to their very first Super Bowl in more than half a century. So a lot of questions about that. Here's another question that people are entering the season with. Can Sean Payton and Russell Wilson generate magic together? Wilson's debut with the Broncos was a hot mess, but now with Payton on board, we'll see. Another question is, how rusty is Deshaun Watson for his first full season as a Brown? He's the third highest rated passer in NFL history, but he missed, all of the 2021 season and was suspended for the majority of last year's debut with the Browns. But the biggest question going into this year's season, at least in my neck of the woods, is whether Carolina's gamble to trade up to number 1 in the draft for Bryce Young is going to work. You can put me down in the optimistic camp. But those are just some of the most pressing football questions. As fun as it is, and fantasy football as well, playing that, I think we all know, obviously, it's just a game. That's all it is. It's a sport. It carries no ultimate significance for our lives. So however those questions get answered, it doesn't matter. Not in the grand scheme of things. But that's not true of every set of questions. Some questions matter more than others. Questions like, how best to manage your money? Maybe you're approaching retirement. Those become critical questions. The best way to care for your physical health. Or questions surrounding how to raise a child or face a challenge with a child. Or how do you have a marathon marriage, the one that really goes the distance? Questions about those things matter a whole lot more than football. But nothing matters more than what's at the top. And those are questions about spiritual things. And let me tell you why. If there's any substance to spirituality, if we have a soul, and we are in fact eternal creatures and truly face some kind of afterlife that is based in any way, shape, or form on what happens in this life, then what else matters more than getting that part of our lives right, getting those answers right? Today, we're going to start a series. It's just this week and next week because it's called Two Questions. And it's a look at the two most important spiritual questions of all, particularly when it comes to the Christian faith. And the first one is one that has been asked since the very beginning of the Christian faith. It's one of the most pressing questions of all when you think about the Christian faith. For example, I found this was interesting. I ran across this once in my study of history. Napoleon Bonaparte dominated Europe and global affairs for nearly a decade. Rising to power during the French Revolution through a series of conquests, he eventually ruled all of continental Europe. He's considered to be one of the greatest military commanders that has ever lived, and his campaigns are studied at military schools to this very day. In fact, there's a new film, you may have heard about it, that's coming out about his life, directed by Ridley Scott, with Joaquin Phoenix in the lead, teaming up again for the first time since they were together for Ridley Scott's earlier movie, The Gladiator. When Napoleon, in 1808, and at the height of his powers as Emperor of the French, met with the German scholar Wieland, he could have asked the famed intellect anything about the dynamics of world affairs, for example. But he wasn't interested in talking about politics. He wasn't interested in talking about war. Napoleon had one burning question he wanted to ask the famed author and professor. And that to him, in his thinking, was the most important question of all. What do you think about Jesus? That was Napoleon's question. And we're still asking that question. Let me give you some Google stats just for fun. I went and played around a little bit with this. I mentioned the start of the NFL season. Let's see how Aaron Rodgers is doing right now. When I Googled Rodgers this past week, I got a hefty 55 million responses back. Well, then I switched to entertainment and I plugged in Beyonce, who is now out on her Renaissance World Tour. She got 420 million results, kind of dwarfed Rodgers. But as much as I like her music, she's not the biggest artist on tour right now, much less the biggest, most popular artist in the world. I think we all know who that is. It goes to Miss Taylor Swift, who, when Googled, got 739 million results. Then I plugged in Jesus. And when I did, I didn't get 55 million. I didn't get 420 million. I didn't get 739 million. I got 2.2 billion results. He's the most engaging, talked about spiritual figure in all of human history and the founder of the world's largest religious faith. And we still are Googling him more than anyone or anything. Which is why the first of the two most important questions you can ask is this: who was he? So who was Jesus? I mean, there's a lot there that's pretty easy to know about him. It's low-hanging fruit. It's not contested. We know that he existed. No scholar, no matter where they might stand in the Christian faith itself, denies that this man, Jesus, the one the Bible talks about, existed in time and space and history. He's one of the most documented figures in all of human history. You find him, for example, in the writings, listed in the writings of Thales, who was a first century Greek writer, Pliny the Younger, who was a lawyer and an author of ancient Rome, mentions him. You find him mentioned by the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, as well as the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Of course, the most detailed account record is found in the Bible that gives not one, but 4 independent eyewitness biographical accounts written by the men Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. More than a few historians have noted that as a result of all this, Jesus really is the most documented life in all of ancient history. So we know Jesus existed. We also know that his teaching was of such a compelling nature that to this day, it's part of our cultural ethos, whether it's memorable lines like "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," or timeless stories like the prodigal son. No one has been more culturally influential in terms of spiritual matters. We also know that miracles were attributed to him. Whether you buy into the possibility of miracles or not, people who witnessed his life say that he did them. We know that he was sentenced to death through a Jewish and then Roman legal process. We know that on the 3rd day after his execution, there was an empty tomb. A stone was rolled away. The body was gone, even though heavily guarded by Roman troops. And we know his followers then went running around the landscape saying that Jesus had risen from the dead and that they had seen him and they had talked with him, they'd interacted with him. And it wasn't just one of the disciples making that claim or even just a handful, but all of them. There were even records of groups numbering in the hundreds who witnessed the resurrected Jesus at the same time. We also know that after that time of the empty tomb, that first Easter, the Jesus movement exploded. By AD 100, there were around 7,500 followers. By AD 310, there were more than 30 million. That's rapid growth. And today there are billions, and it is the world's largest religious faith. But does that answer who he really was? See, not really. It doesn't. To get at that, we've got to go a little deeper. It's something that Jesus himself encouraged. Let me read you a bit of back and forth between Jesus and his early followers that he is captured for us in Mark's biography of Jesus. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee, and they went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say you are one of the other prophets, brought back to life. Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." Now, for Peter to say that Jesus was the Messiah literally meant that he was the Christ, the anointed one, the one sent by God to save the world. But how should you answer the question? Well, let's start off by looking at how Jesus answered the question, because he did. He stated his identity loud and clear. He said that he was God himself in human form. He even claimed the very name of God for himself. Little background. When the Jewish leader Moses encountered God, he asked for God's name. was an interesting setting. God was speaking to Moses, telling him to go to the highest authority and power in the land and demand that he release all of his Jewish slaves. And Moses understandably wanted to have a little credibility. So he asked God, well, give me your name, the very name of God, so that I can say to the people exactly, who has sent me. And here's the answer God gave to Moses. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say. I am has sent me to you. Now that phrase, that name, I am, is considered the most holy word in existence because it is the very name of God. It was considered so holy that the Jews would not even write it completely out. They would only write out the 4 consonants. They wouldn't write out the vowels. So they would just write it YHWH. Scholars used to think that it was pronounced, if you put the vowels in the right place, that you would pronounce it Jehovah. But we now know that the closest we can make of the actual name in light of the missing vowels is that it was pronounced Yahweh. God said, my name is Yahweh. I am. Now fast forward to Jesus. He was being asked directly about his identity. Let me read it. Who do you think you are? People said. Jesus answered, your father Abraham rejoiced as he looked forward to my coming. He saw it and was glad. The people said, you aren't even 50 years old. How can you say you have seen Abraham? Jesus answered, I tell you the truth. Before Abraham was even born, I am. At that point, they picked up stones to throw at him. Jesus claimed the very name of God for himself. He said, you want to know who I am? I'll tell you. I am God, Yahweh. And the people listening understood him completely because they picked up stones to stone him because this was nothing less than blasphemy. Here in their minds, a mere man was claiming to be God himself. But this mere man made that claim repeatedly throughout his life. Here's more from Jesus. In John's biography, he said, I am the Son of God. Mark's biography, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ? I am, said Jesus. Recorded in John's biography, Jesus told him, I am the way, the truth, the life. You still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Now, real quick, let me talk a little bit about that father-son language because some of you may be puzzled by it or have always wondered about it, and understandably so. If Jesus was God in human form, why did he call himself the Son of God, and why did he pray to his Father as God? Well, it helps to understand and be clear about what it was that Jesus was claiming about his identity. He claimed to be God, but it was always God the Son, the second person of the Trinity. Now, hang with me here. This is really important, and I'll make this theology as painless as possible, but it's important theology. One of the most amazing teachings in the Bible about God is that God is triune. That his very nature is Trinity. The Bible teaches the oneness of God, that there aren't many gods, there's just one God. But then the Bible follows up that oneness with another teaching, that there are 3 persons who are each referred to as God. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Not 3 gods, but 3 persons who are one God. So you find Jesus referring to God the Father, but then referring to himself as God as well. And he was God the Son. To be the son of someone in the way Jesus was referring to meant to be of the same order as that person, to have the same qualities of that person. Now, I know all this triune, Trinity can be a mind-boggling kind of thing, and it should be mind-boggling. There should be some mind-boggling things when it comes to God. There should be some things that the Bible says about God, or that God says about himself as recorded in the Bible, that you just go, what? I'm not sure I can wrap my head around that, but that's good, because if we could wrap our heads around everything related to God, then God would be no bigger than our intellect, and that would be a small God. God says my nature is triune. Deal with it. So in Jesus, we have a person who walked the earth and claimed to be God the Son, the second person of the Trinity in human form. No other major religious figure has ever made that claim. Not Buddha, not Muhammad, not Confucius. Only Jesus made the claim to be God himself come to planet Earth. So what do you do with that? Well, if you think about it, there's only 4 options. First, you could conclude that Jesus was a stark, raving lunatic. Maybe he did think he was God, but he was severely sick psychologically. Now, the problem, though, is that in most cases of severe psychological disorder, which this would be, the background of the person makes it very clear that they had a profile and that they had a history of mental illness. But nothing in the historical record of the life of Jesus exhibits even a single sign of any of the classical manifestations of mental health issues, such as the inability to relate to the real world, or inadequacy in personal relationships, or deficiencies in verbal skills. In fact, psychiatrist J.T. Fisher concluded that if you were to survey all the psychological data which his discipline has to offer and boil it down to one essential and perfect prescription for mental health, he said it would be the Sermon on the Mount, the most famous message Jesus ever preached. So let's just say that putting Jesus in the insane category is a little sketchy. A second choice would be to say that he was simply a liar. He said he was God, but obviously he knew he wasn't. But this would be saying that the man whose teaching was the standard for integrity and honesty throughout the civilized world was a habitual, premeditated, pathological liar. Even more important to remember is that Jesus was arrested and mocked and beaten and tortured prior to his execution. He was offered a full pardon by the Roman governor Pilate if he would simply deny his claim to be God. If a con man could stop a nail being driven into the flesh of his hand by telling the truth and even be rewarded for it, he would. People who are playing the system for personal gain change their game when it stops paying off. They keep up the lie until the deception costs more than what they would have been gained through the deceit. But Jesus endured it all. He never denied his claim to be God, though given every chance. Well, the third option would be to say that Jesus was just a good man, maybe even a prophet from God. But that's all. Let's just stop there. We won't go beyond that. Good man, maybe a prophet, but none of this other stuff. Not many people want to say Jesus was a liar or a lunatic, but they aren't sure they want to say he's God either. So they land on him simply being a good man, a holy man, but that's all. But there's a problem with that one too. And whenever I kind of think about this option, I think about some words that C.S. Lewis once wrote that have always stood with me. If you know anything about C.S. Lewis, beyond just that he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Chronicles of Narnia, and things like that, he was a brilliant intellect who served as a professor of both Cambridge and Oxford. He actually journeyed. He started off as an atheist and eventually wound up a Christian and coming to faith in Jesus. In fact, it was through a late night conversation with another famous author, J.R.R. Tolkien of Lord of the Rings fame. Tolkien was a Christian. He and Lewis were very dear friends. And on a walk one night behind Magdalen, in Magdalen College, called Addison's Walk, and I've walked it many times during my studies at Oxford. And Lewis and Tolkien were talking about Christianity, and that was the night that Lewis crossed the line of faith. But it was at the end of a long intellectual journey, one that left him convinced that Jesus really was who he said he was. And here's what he wrote as he was weighing it himself too. But here's what he wrote about this good man option. I thought it was really interesting. He said, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." Well, that is the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So who is Jesus? Lord, liar, or lunatic? Or as Jesus himself would ask, who do you say I am? Well, you might be wondering, well, I don't want to say he's a liar and I don't want to say he was insane, but how do I know for sure that he's Lord? I get the weakness of the other answers, but I don't want to make my decision on the basis of the process of elimination alone. Is there anything else tangible to judge him by? And the answer is yes, there is. And it's something that Jesus himself said, this is how you can test me. This is how you can check me out. This is how you can determine whether everything I've said is real, right, or wrong. Over and over again, Jesus made it clear. The ultimate litmus test for him is that he would be killed. And he said, on the third day, I'll rise again. That's how you can tell if what I say is true. That would be the ultimate validation of everything he said about who he was. And he invited anyone and everyone to judge him by whether or not it happened. And this was so understood by everyone who followed him that this was the ultimate test. As one of the leaders of the early church, Paul wrote, he said, if there's no resurrection for Christ, everything we've told you is smoke and mirrors, and everything you staked your life on is smoke and mirrors. Not only that, but we would be guilty of telling a string of bare-faced lies about God. All these affidavits we passed on to you verifying that God raised up Christ, sheer fabrications if there's no resurrection. But then he added, but the truth is, Christ has been raised up. But is that the truth? I mean, did that happen? You know, you only have really two options when it comes to the empty tomb. Either the disciples stole the body and then spread the idea that he rose from the dead, or Jesus rose from the dead. And even at the time back then, those were the two things. You had Christians running around saying that they'd seen Jesus rose from the dead. You had other people saying, the disciples must have just stolen the body. These were the two competing narratives, because every other option isn't really an option. Let me tell you what I mean by these non-options. I mean, the Jewish or Roman authorities didn't steal the body. They were the ones who put guards at the tomb to make sure the body wasn't stolen. Their biggest fear was somebody stealing the body. They understood Christianity to be an incredible threat against both Jewish authority and Roman rule. The last thing they would do is steal the body to make it look like he rose from the dead, which would make him and the Christian movement more believable than ever. These guys wish they did have the body. They would have paraded it through the streets of Jerusalem saying, see, just a man. Here's his beat up, crucified corpse to prove it. This is also why nobody has seriously entertained the idea that the resurrection can be written off as some kind of mass hallucination due to people's stress or emotional grief. Or that perhaps, they mistook someone else, someone who was very much alive, for the very dead Jesus. Not only would a hallucination or a missighting have to account for every single eyewitness account, but the simple production of a dead body by the Romans would have brought everybody back to reality. And believe me, they would have gladly produced it. This is also why nobody thinks that on the first Easter morning, the disciples just went to the wrong tomb, found it empty, then thought Jesus must be alive. The problem with this view is that all the Romans had to do is just point out the right tomb where the guards were posted and the party would have ended. And no one today suggests that the reason people saw Jesus after the resurrection, after the crucifixion, is because another reason is nobody believes it's because he never died. That on the third day that he just woke up, felt better, and that was that. That's never been one that's had a lot of traction. Just remember, he received 39 lashes before even the crucifixion with weighted hooks and lead, and 40 was considered a death penalty. And then he was made to drag his heavy wooden cross to where he was crucified until he collapsed and could carry it no further. And then he was nailed to the cross and hung there on the cross until he essentially suffocated to death, because you had to push yourself up against the spike that were in your heels to breathe. You would eventually tire and then choke to death. And then, just to make sure that he was dead, he was pierced in the side with a lance and pronounced dead by Roman medical experts. Could anyone seriously believe that after he was then laid in a damp tomb in burial cloths and 75 pounds of burial spices and going from Friday to Sunday without food, water, or medical attention of any kind, that he suddenly popped up, single-handedly rolled back a stone weighing thousands of pounds, and then also single-handedly overpowered a crack team of Romans, heavily armed, heavily armored elite fighting troops, and then started walking around, looking and acting and appearing as if physically nothing had happened. Just a few holes here and there, but nothing other worse for wear. The resurrection is easier to believe than that. But even more telling is that medical experts have pored over the biblical record of Jesus' death. There was even an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the gold standard of medical research, and it was titled, On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. Among the article's points is that the Bible records with great detail that when the spear pierced Jesus' side, both water and blood spilled out. Now, the eyewitnesses who recorded that didn't know it at the time. We know now that that's a medically significant detail. It was a sign that the spear pierced the pericardium, which is the sac that surrounds the heart, as well as the heart itself. It's a description of the post-mortem separation of the blood into clot and serum, indicating that Jesus was truly dead. So, if we know that the Jewish and Roman authorities didn't steal the body, there wasn't any kind of mass hallucination or a case of mistaken identity, they didn't go to the wrong tomb, and Jesus didn't just pass out on the cross and get feeling better in a day or two, let's look at the one seemingly viable option of the resurrection, and that was that the disciples stole the body. Jesus said he would rise from the dead on the third day. So on the third day, they stole the body so that it would look like it really happened. There's some problems with that. Serious problems. One is that the tomb was protected by a full guard of Roman soldiers. Now, a Roman guard contained up to 16 highly trained, heavily armed professional fighting men. You couldn't have just snuck by them during the night because that would have taken all 16 guards to be asleep at the same time. And even the ones posted to keep watch at night. And if you know anything about Roman history and the military, the Roman penalty for sleeping on guard duty was execution. Staying awake on duty was one of the highest values the Roman army held. If there was one thing a Roman soldier would never do is sleep when they were on duty and to be on watch. So this would call for the most sacred vow and highest value of the Roman military to be uniformly discarded by all 16 of them at once. But even more important, rolling away, so let's say they were asleep. Rolling away a 2-ton stone makes noise. Lots of noise. The kind of noise that wakes up sleeping Roman guards. But that's not even the biggest reason why this would be hard to believe. Let's say they pulled it off. Let's say all 16 guards were asleep. Let's say that they did sneak by. Let's say they did roll the stone away without waking anybody, and somehow they stole the body out from underneath the noses of the guards. According to all 4 independent biographical accounts of Jesus' life and teaching in the Bible, the first witnesses to the resurrection were said to be women. This would never have been invented by even the least sophisticated conspirators who wanted to authenticate a failed religious leader, because Jewish courts didn't even accept the testimony of female witnesses. They were so low in the social order of the misogynistic society of that day that 15 women, 50 women, 500 women could witness a crime and it would never be entertained in any court of law. So if you're going to steal the body and lie about a resurrection, in the first century male-dominated Jewish culture of the day, you wouldn't say, hey, let's have our eyewitnesses start off with women. Let's just make that our story. But here's a second, even bigger problem. 11 of the 12 disciples, who hypothetically stole the body and then lied about it, died martyr deaths. Meaning they willingly, purposefully died for their story. They were killed for claiming to be eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. None of them recanted, even when given every reason to, even the threat of death. I say 11 of the 12 because of John. They tried to kill him. They were unsuccessful, so he ended up being exiled to the island of Patmos until he died. But think about this. Each of the disciples was faced with a decisive moment. Deny what you say about Jesus and his resurrection and live, or cling to your pathetic story and die the most cruel, painful, vicious death we can bring to bear. Your call. Every single disciple that faced that test of torture and martyrdom for the sake and truth of the resurrection of Jesus. They faced it and themselves as personal eyewitnesses to that resurrection, and they stood their ground. And it cost them everything. Tradition has it that James was beheaded. Matthew was slain with a combination battle axe and spear. Philip was whipped, thrown into prison, and then crucified. Mark died after being dragged through the streets of Alexandria. Peter was crucified in Rome. James was thrown from the top of the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem and was then beaten to death with a fuller's club. Bartholomew was beaten and then crucified. Andrew was bound to a cross from which it is said he preached to his persecutors until his death. Thomas was run through the body with a lance. Jude was shot with arrows and then crucified. And Matthias, who replaced Judas Iscariot, was stoned and then beheaded. Again, think about that. We all know that people will die for what they believe to be true, what they think is true, even though it may be false. We see that all the time. But people don't have a tendency to die for what they know is a lie. And don't forget, these were men who also had been so timid, so scared, so fragile in their faith that they denied even knowing Jesus after his arrest and went into hiding after his crucifixion. Yet after their claim of witnessing the resurrection, each went willingly to a martyr's death that could have been avoided. If only they had said, you're right, I'm wrong. It never happened, never saw anything. Truth is, we stole the body, we'll take you to it right now. They didn't. They each went to their death saying, Jesus has risen. I am a witness. Kill me if you must. But he is the Messiah. He's alive. So did the disciples steal the body? The evidence would make that very hard to believe, which leaves us with one last option. Jesus rose from the dead. He did what he said he would do because he was who he said he was. That's how I've answered the question. It's how Christians around the world have answered the question. But how you answer is obviously up to you. But I will tell you this. Next week, when we tackle the second of the two most important spiritual questions you can ask, you're going to want to reflect on how you answered this week's question, because it will prove to be decisive. Let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much. I thank you so much for Jesus coming to planet Earth, living the perfect life, dying on the cross for me, raised on the third day, saying very clearly, sin is not the last word of my life, much less death. Thank you so much that we have so much evidence to work with, and that Jesus made it very clear how we can test him. And I pray that anyone who is wondering about Jesus and who he was today was somehow helpful. They maybe even felt you tapping them on the shoulder of their heart, saying, "Who do you say I am?" Inviting them to say, "You are the Messiah." Oh, I pray that in the name of Jesus. Amen.